The tense silence at the gas station felt like it was on the brink of explosion. The flashing lights from the police cruiser cast distorted shadows on the ground, creating a scene that seemed straight out of a nightmare. Jacob, still trapped in the black SUV with his seatbelt fastened tightly across his chest, watched Officer Jake with growing apprehension. He knew that any misinterpreted movement could result in tragedy, so he kept his hands visible and his gestures controlled. Jake, on the other hand, struggled with the tide of prejudices clouding his mind. He saw Jacob's uniform, but something inside him refused to believe that the black man in front of him was actually a veteran Air Force lieutenant. Doubt mingled with fear, and fear quickly turned into escalating aggression. "I'm not asking again, get out of the car now," Jake shouted, his voice trembling with restrained fury. He wanted Jacob to exit the vehicle, but the man's cautious demeanor only fed his paranoia. Why isn't he getting out? What is he hiding? These thoughts churned relentlessly in his mind. Jacob, aware of the gravity of the situation, responded calmly. "I'm not moving while you're pointing that gun at me. I don't want you to think I'm reaching for a weapon or anything like that." These words, meant to calm Jake, only fueled his distrust. The officer felt sweat trickle down his forehead as he gripped his gun tightly. He knew he needed to control the situation, but Jacob's refusal to exit the car infuriated him. Believing he was being challenged, Jake decided to take an action he deemed necessary to force Jacob's compliance. "Think you can challenge me?" Jake muttered, his voice low but laden with threat. He looked at the other officer, Simon, who stood by the cruiser, observing the situation cautiously. "Hand me the pepper spray, now." Simon hesitated for a moment, but Jake's order was clear. He quickly grabbed the pepper spray canister and handed it to his colleague. Jake approached the driver's side window, where Jacob still had his hands up, visible, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "Last chance, get out of the car." Jake shouted again, now holding the pepper spray in his right hand and his gun in his left. Jacob realized what was about to happen, but before he could protest, Jake pulled the trigger on the pepper spray, spraying a cloud of it directly into Jacob's face. The burning sensation was immediate, as if his face was on fire. His eyes began to water uncontrollably, his vision blurring as the pepper spray penetrated his skin and mucous membranes, burning like an invisible flame. "Damn it!" Jacob exclaimed, his voice muffled by the excruciating pain. He tried to wipe his eyes, but the burning sensation was too intense. Struggling against the growing panic that threatened to overwhelm him, he fumbled to unbuckle his seatbelt. "Now get out of the car!" Jake shouted triumphantly, as if he had finally broken Jacob's resistance. Still blinded by the pepper spray, Jacob managed to open the door with a trembling hand and began to exit the vehicle, stumbling as he tried to orient himself. His vision was completely compromised, and he could barely see the officers in front of him. The burning in his eyes made it nearly impossible to keep his balance, and each step was a struggle. As soon as Jacob was out of the car, Jake acted swiftly. He moved in and, without hesitation, grabbed Jacob by the neck and forced him to the ground. "Hands behind your back," Jake ordered, using all his strength to restrain Jacob. The lieutenant tried to resist, but the pepper spray had sapped his strength. Simon quickly joined Jake, and together, the two officers forced Jacob to the ground with brutality. Jacob's body was pressed against the cold, rough asphalt, his arms twisted behind him as Jake used his knee to pin Jacob's back. Pain radiated in waves down Jacob's spine, but he could barely react, the pepper spray's burn obscuring any ability to think clearly. "Stay down," Jake growled, his voice dripping with an authority that was, at that moment, being severely abused. Simon, more subdued, struggled to put handcuffs on Jacob's wrists. Jacob's heavy breathing and the effort to maintain any control over his body were palpable, but he was completely subdued. The weight of the two officers on top of him, combined with the unbearable burning sensation, made it clear he had no choice. "What's this guy's problem?" Simon panted, finally locking the cuffs with a sharp click. He looked at Jake for some kind of guidance, but Jake's face was locked in an expression of blind rage. Jake quickly stood up, pulling Jacob up by the handcuffed arms. The lieutenant was gasping, his body shaking as he tried to fight against the burning in his eyes and the pain in his back. Even in that state, his mind refused to give in completely. "I'm an Air Force lieutenant," he kept repeating to himself, trying to maintain some sense of dignity amidst the humiliation. "Get up," Jake ordered, his voice still tense, pulling Jacob with unnecessary force. Jacob could barely stand. His eyes were closed, tears mingling with the sweat streaming down his face. The pain was unbearable, but he knew that any additional resistance would only worsen his situation. Still, his mind was racing. How had things escalated to this point? How could a simple misjudgment lead to this level of violence? As Jake and Simon dragged Jacob toward the cruiser, the surroundings seemed to close in with unbearable tension. Simon, despite trying to fulfill what he saw as his duty, began to feel a pang of doubt. Is this going too far? He wondered but didn't dare voice it. Is he resisting? Jake asked coldly as he felt Jacob hesitate for a moment. "I can't breathe right," Jacob gasped, trying to speak, but his words came out jagged from pain and exhaustion. "That's because you're flailing," Jake retorted harshly, ignoring the obvious. The three reached the cruiser, and with a rough shove, Jake pressed Jacob against the hood, applying unnecessary force. Simon opened the rear door, ready to shove Jacob into the back seat. Adrenaline surged among the officers, but for different reasons. Jake was in a state of aggressive control, blinded by a mix of prejudice and the need to assert authority. Simon, on the other hand, was beginning to feel an unsettling doubt, a small voice in his mind questioning exactly what they were doing. The gas station, now enveloped in an aura of tension and despair, was partially illuminated by the flashing lights of the police cruiser. The image of Jacob, handcuffed and suffering from the pepper spray, was etched into the minds of everyone involved. Jake and Simon, after the harsh approach, were about to take Jacob to the nearest station. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of their actions and the anticipation of what would come next. Jacob, still gasping and with his eyes swollen from pain, was placed in the cruiser with Simon's help. Jake, with a forced expression of firmness, took the wheel and drove with a sense of duty fulfilled, though the gravity of the situation was beginning to weigh on him. The silence in the car was thick, punctuated only by Jacob's muffled cries, which were becoming increasingly sporadic. "How are you feeling, Lieutenant?" Jake tried to break the silence, his voice attempting to sound casual but failing to hide the tension. Jacob didn't answer immediately. He was struggling with the burning in his eyes and the pain in his body. Finally, he croaked, "You know this isn't right, don't you?" Jake didn't respond. Instead, he focused on the road, his mind spinning with a mix of doubt and resistance. Simon, beside Jacob, avoided eye contact, his own conscience troubled by the decisions made that night. Meanwhile, social media began to fill up with videos and accounts of Jacob's violent treatment. The incident quickly spread, and outrage swept across digital platforms. The images and reports reached the highest echelons of government, eventually landing on the desk of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Robert Mitchell. General Mitchell, an imposing man in his mid-50s with a commanding presence and unshakable authority, received an urgent call about Jacob's situation. After viewing the footage and reading the reports, his concern turned into resolve. He knew the situation had escalated beyond simple misconduct and that the honor of the armed forces was at stake. He decided to act immediately. Mitchell summoned a convoy of military personnel to accompany him to the station where Jacob was being held. The convoy, consisting of high-ranking officers and security, reflected the seriousness of the visit. With his team, the general departed in a heavily escorted official vehicle, knowing that his presence would signify that the situation was being addressed with the utmost seriousness. The station was quiet when Mitchell's entourage arrived. The officers, surprised by the military apparatus approaching, tried to remain calm. The general and his team disembarked from the convoy with an authority that left no room for questioning. "This is General Mitchell," he announced, his voice firm and clear. "I'm here to check on the status of one of our officers, Lieutenant Jacob." "Where is he?" The duty officer at the station, visibly intimidated by the general's presence, nodded quickly. "The lieutenant is being held in a holding cell." "I'll take you there." Mitchell followed the officer through the station, his team maintaining a respectful but alert distance. The general understood the importance of staying composed and ensuring everything was handled according to military and legal protocols. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Jacob sat on a bench, his head bowed and hands still cuffed. The pain from the pepper spray was gradually subsiding, but the sense of humiliation and anger was overwhelming. He heard the door open and lifted his head, his eyes still teary but now reflecting a glimmer of hope and expectation. General Mitchell entered the room, his imposing presence immediately easing the tense atmosphere. He approached Jacob with a look of genuine concern. "Lieutenant Jacob," Mitchell began, his voice carrying an authority that needed no further assertion. "I'm General Mitchell. We're here to understand what happened and to ensure you receive the treatment you deserve." Jacob looked up at the general, the pain and fatigue visible on his face, but also a growing relief at seeing the authoritative figure he knew and respected. "General. Thank you for coming." Mitchell signaled for the soldiers to remain at a respectful distance and then sat down next to Jacob. "We'll get this sorted out. But first, we need to understand what happened here. Are you able to talk about the incident?" Jacob nodded slowly, still struggling to recover from the emotional and physical toll of what he had endured. "Yes, General. Officer Jake, he didn't believe I was a lieutenant. He thought I was resisting, so he used pepper spray and—" The general listened intently, his expression hardening at the injustice of what he was hearing. He knew that Jacob's account would be the first step in addressing the situation fairly and transparently. As Jacob began to detail the events, Mitchell took notes and maintained constant eye contact, demonstrating his seriousness and determination to resolve the issue. He knew this wouldn't be the end and that further investigations would follow, but he was committed to ensuring that Lieutenant Jacob received justice and that the truth was revealed. The general's visit was just the beginning of a more complex process that would unravel the layers of prejudice and discrimination underlying the situation, and Jacob knew that the fight for the truth was only beginning. The detention room at the police station was cold and silent, but now, General Mitchell's presence brought a new intensity to the atmosphere. Jacob sat at the table, his handcuffs removed, but still with the humiliation etched on his face. Mitchell, seated beside him, listened intently as Jacob recounted his version of the events. Every word from Jacob carried the pain and frustration of a deep injustice. "So, what happened with Officer Jake?" Mitchell asked, his tone firm but not lacking empathy. "You said he didn't believe you were a lieutenant. Any idea why he reacted that way?" Jacob sighed, the pain from the night still present in every muscle. "I don't know, General. Maybe he saw the uniform and just couldn't believe I was who I said I was. Or maybe he let his prejudice take over. Whatever it was, he was determined to treat me like a threat." Mitchell quickly made a note, his gaze never leaving Jacob. He knew he needed to gather as much information as possible to handle the situation properly. "What we know is that the situation will be reviewed," Mitchell said. "The general's visit is a clear statement that we're not going to ignore what happened. But to ensure this doesn't happen again and to understand all the nuances of the case, I'll need a complete account." Jacob nodded, grateful for the seriousness with which the general was handling the case. "I understand. I'll cooperate in any way necessary." As the conversation continued, a new figure began making waves at the police station. Captain Emma Carter, a distinguished investigator from Internal Affairs, arrived at the station with a determined expression. She had been urgently summoned to join the investigation into Jacob's encounter. Emma was known for her meticulous work and impartial approach, making her an ideal choice to handle the situation. She walked into the room with confidence, her presence immediately captured by those present. Mitchell stood up upon seeing her, offering a respectful nod. "Captain Carter," Mitchell said, his voice firm but courteous. "Thank you for coming so quickly. We're here to understand all the details of the incident involving Lieutenant Jacob." Emma looked at Jacob, her face showing a blend of empathy and professionalism. "General, thank you for the introduction. Lieutenant Jacob, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'll need to ask you some questions and ensure that every aspect of the incident is thoroughly examined." Jacob, still with red eyes and exhausted, nodded. "Of course, Captain. I'm willing to cooperate." Emma began her investigation, asking detailed questions and following a strict protocol. Each of Jacob's answers was recorded with precision, and she showed a special skill in drawing out important details without pressing too hard. During the interview, Emma sensed there was more at play. Jacob's frustration and fear were palpable, but there was a deeper layer of resentment, possibly due to past experiences with discrimination. While Emma worked, the station prepared for an unexpected visitor. An elegant woman with an authoritative stance, known as Sarah Blake, arrived accompanied by a group of aides. Sarah was a prominent figure in local politics, a civil rights attorney with an impressive track record of fighting against injustices. She had heard about Jacob's case and was determined to ensure that the incident was treated with the seriousness it deserved. Sarah approached the interrogation room and was greeted by Emma and Mitchell, who welcomed her with a mix of curiosity and respect. "Ms. Blake," Mitchell began, with a respectful tone. "We are in the midst of a detailed investigation into the incident involving Lieutenant Jacob. How can we assist you?" Sarah looked at Mitchell with a determined expression. "General, I'm here to ensure that Lieutenant Jacob receives the justice he deserves. This case is an opportunity to address deeper issues of bias and discrimination within the police force. I intend to closely monitor the investigation and ensure that all steps are transparent." Mitchell nodded, recognizing the importance of Sarah's role. "Understood. Let's work together to ensure this is resolved as fairly as possible." As Emma and Sarah discussed the next steps, Jacob was caught between hope and anxiety. He understood that the situation was becoming increasingly complex, and the involvement of prominent figures like Sarah Blake and General Mitchell added a new dimension to the case. There was a sense that the truth was about to come to light, but also that many challenges still lay ahead. Emma's investigation continued steadily, but Jacob was unaware that his situation was about to lead to unexpected discoveries. Sarah Blake's presence and Emma's relentless approach began uncovering deeper layers of corruption and discrimination, linking Jacob's case to a web of injustices that stretched far beyond that night at the gas station. Meanwhile, Jake and Simon were under growing pressure from the investigations. They were starting to realize that their approach with Jacob might have repercussions far greater than they had anticipated. The revelations about to emerge would not only impact Jacob's life but also unveil a web of prejudice and corruption that would challenge the justice system. The night was just beginning, and the winds of change were starting to blow, setting the stage for a series of events that would reveal uncomfortable truths and challenge the status quo. Despite still being shaken, Jacob began to feel a small spark of hope that perhaps justice was finally within reach. Jacob's situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The police chief, aware of the gravity of the situation, orchestrated a devious plot to ensure Jacob was charged with contempt of authority. To protect his own officer, the chief manipulated events to portray the incident with Jake as a direct affront to the law. The case quickly escalated and was brought to a civil court. Jacob found himself at the center of a media frenzy, and the issue was no longer just about contempt, it now involved deep layers of racial prejudice and injustice. The police chief knew that if Jacob were convicted, he would face severe disciplinary action and could even be expelled from the Air Force. General Matthews, an old mentor and supporter of Jacob, tried to intervene, but his influence was limited outside the military sphere. In civil court, he could only attest to Jacob's integrity and value as a serviceman, unable to offer a more substantial defense. The case ended up in the hands of Judge Samuel Clark, known for his leftist convictions and disdain for the military. Clark saw Jacob, an Air Force lieutenant, as a representation of the establishment he criticized. With a prejudiced judgment already in place, Jacob knew the battle would be tough. His career and honor were at stake, and the harsh reality of racial discrimination loomed over him. The media, on the other hand, began to fervently rally behind Jacob. Reports highlighted the racial injustice and apparent manipulation of the system, revealing the true face of the prejudice Jacob was facing. He needed a strong base of popular support to balance the scales against the bias manifesting in the courtroom. With a heavy heart, Jacob prepared to face the court. In a tense meeting with his lawyer, he said, "It's not just my career at stake here. It's my honor, the respect I've earned over the years. And now, because of the color of my skin, I'm seeing justice being twisted against me." His lawyer, a serious and determined man, responded, "Jacob, we know this is more than just a legal battle. It's a fight for dignity and truth. We have the support of the media and public opinion, but we need more than that. We need to show the court that you're more than just a target of prejudice. We need them to see the man you are, and the value you represent." Jacob nodded, his gaze fixed on the window of the office, contemplating the uncertain future that lay ahead. He knew the fight was just beginning and that the true challenge would be to maintain faith and dignity in the face of relentless adversity. Tension in the courtroom was at its peak. Judge Samuel Clark, under immense pressure from the media coverage and public protests, was visibly irritated. Jacob's case had turned into a symbol of racial injustice, and Clark struggled to remain impartial. In a rushed decision, he sentenced Jacob to prison, disregarding the nuances of the case and the devastating impact on the lieutenant's life. The ruling left General Matthews enraged. With a grave and firm expression, he approached the bench to confront Clark. "Judge Clark, I urge you to reconsider your decision. Jacob is a war veteran with a history of bravery and exemplary service. His conviction not only compromises justice but also disrespects the sacrifice he has made for this country. I request that you evaluate his situation with the sensitivity that his experience and value deserve." Clark looked at Matthews with a cold stare, unmoved by his appeal. However, the public pressure was not waning. Jacob's lawyer, aware of the need to increase the pressure, deliberately leaked a powerful video to the media. The video showed Jacob rescuing a wounded comrade in combat, carrying him on his back with remarkable courage. The footage sparked a wave of public empathy and outrage. Meanwhile, the police chief, worried about the possibility of his scheme being uncovered, had manipulated the evidence, making the gas station footage that could prove Jacob's innocence disappear. However, fate had other plans. A customer at the station, who had witnessed the misconduct, had recorded the incident on his phone. The customer, a middle-aged man named Marcus, who had observed the officer's unjust behavior, sought out Jacob's lawyer. Determined to ensure the truth came to light, Marcus handed over the footage, which clearly showed the officer's improper conduct and how they had manipulated the situation against Jacob. Jacob's lawyer, now armed with this crucial evidence, presented the footage in court. The video clearly depicted the officer's abuse of power and the police chief's manipulation. This irrefutable proof turned the case on its head. The media, now with a fresh scandal to latch onto, shifted its focus sharply to the new evidence. The streets were abuzz, with reporters interviewing outraged citizens and questioning the integrity of the judicial system. Jacob's lawyer delivered a powerful statement. "This footage is undeniable proof that the truth has been distorted. The injustice my client has suffered cannot be ignored. Jacob is a hero, not a criminal. We demand true justice." With the new evidence and the growing public pressure, the court was forced to reconsider the case. Judge Clark, now with his reputation on the line, had no choice but to review his decision. Jacob, still shaken but hopeful, knew that the battle was far from over, but this unexpected turn gave him a renewed chance to fight for justice and restore his honor. He looked at his lawyer and General Matthews, feeling a wave of gratitude and a newfound determination to face the challenges ahead. The stage had shifted, and Jacob's struggle, now more visible than ever, was taking on new dimensions. The story was far from over, and the fight for truth and justice continued, with new alliances and challenges emerging at every turn. The pressure on Judge Samuel Clark and the police chief had reached its breaking point. The streets were filled with posters bearing the judge's and the chief's faces, with slogans like, "Racist system will not stand." TV programs were eager to interview Jacob's wife, but his family, already worn down by the pressure, initially resisted. However, she eventually decided to speak out. The interview was a resounding success. Jacob's wife, with a steady gaze and a voice full of emotion, recounted the pain and injustice the family had endured. Her courage and honesty resonated with many, generating an even greater wave of public support. The media and social networks amplified the outrage, forcing a more critical re-examination of the case. Clark, now fully cornered by the weight of public opinion and the damning evidence circulating on social media, which showed Jacob being unjustly assaulted, had no choice but to reverse his decision. He ordered Jacob's release and the arrest of the 2 officers involved in the scandal. Jake, the officer who initiated the chain of events, was expelled from the police force. Simon, the second officer, managed to argue, with his lawyer's help, that Jake had misled him into arresting Jacob. While he was held accountable, Simon wasn't expelled but was instead sentenced to prison, a significant concession given the circumstances. The day of Jacob's release was a momentous occasion. He was surrounded by his wife and children, who were visibly emotional and relieved. The scene was filled with journalists and reporters. Jacob made sure to give a statement to one of the reporters, expressing his profound gratitude. "I stand here today, not just as a free man, but as a testament to the power of truth and the resilience of justice. I want to thank everyone who stood by me, my family, my lawyer, General Matthews, and all those who raised their voices against this injustice. This isn't just my victory, it's a victory for every person who believes in fairness, dignity, and the right to be treated with respect, regardless of their background. The fight isn't over, but today, we've taken a crucial step toward a more just world. Thank you." Jacob's speech was met with applause and recognition, and he felt an immense weight lifted from his shoulders. The fight for justice had been far from easy, but the determination and support of so many had turned a moment of great adversity into a significant victory. Jacob knew that the road ahead could still be complicated and full of challenges, but for now, he could savor the triumph of justice and his return to his family and dignity. The widespread public support and media attention had ensured that the truth was heard and that justice was served. Following Jacob's speech, the impact was profound and immediate. The wave of public support and intense media pressure left no doubt about the need for significant changes. The police chief, who had manipulated the case and conspired against Jacob, was finally removed from his position. This decision was a crucial step in restoring trust in the institution. The removal of the police chief triggered a series of reforms within the department. Under the leadership of the new interim chief, changes were implemented to ensure greater transparency and accountability. Internal investigations were conducted to identify and remove any other officers involved in corrupt or discriminatory practices. Police officers underwent intensive training on civil rights and bias management, aiming to prevent such injustices from happening again. The department also adopted new policies for monitoring and reviewing conduct, with a greater emphasis on ensuring that all police actions were fair and respected the rights of citizens. Meanwhile, Jacob and his family found a fresh start, free from the shadows of the injustice they had faced. Jacob resumed his activities with a renewed sense of purpose, engaging in social justice causes and working to ensure that the changes implemented in the police department were not just temporary but reflected a lasting commitment to equity and integrity. Jacob's case became a powerful example of how public pressure and collective support can lead to significant and positive changes. And while the fight for justice remained an ongoing effort, Jacob's victory was a powerful testament to resilience and the strength of the truth.